Hey folks, Zach Osterman here. Insider Indianapolis Star. This will be Mind Your Banners. It's Mind Your Banners special. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm wearing the same shirt that I was for our weekly podcast with Mike Nislik because I more or less recorded these back to back on Tuesday. This will probably not come out until Wednesday or Thursday, but I wanted to explain that I promise I do wear clean clothes. He is Galen Clavio. If you're watching on video, you can see him on the other side of the screen. And this is a Mind Your Banner special. First of all, Galen, thank you so much for joining us yet again. We call in the big guns when it's when everything's going in a certain direction.
Happy to be here as always. I appreciate the invite. I'm just thrilled things are going in the right direction.
So. That's true. They often haven't in the past. Wanted to bring you on because I wrote something Sunday, and I hope this doesn't sound self-aggrandizing, but it is adjacent to an argument you and I have had a number of times, or a debate. I wouldn't say an argument. We're not yelling at each other. That basically, how does football work at IU? Because really, with the exception of a couple of brief bursts, the biggest one being about 1987 to 93 under Bill Mallory. Indiana's never really found a formula for football in the post-war era. I don't think that's unfair to say. Obviously, John Pond had the Rose Bowl year. Lee Corso had the Holiday Bowl year. But generally speaking, Indiana has just not been able to foster something that culturally could last. And I'm not suggesting that through 8 games of his first season, Curt Cignetti has sort of forever and I made IU a football school. But I was asked to kind of, write something summing up basically what I saw last weekend and what I thought it meant. And I got that question in a number of different ways on, Friday, Saturday, Sunday from people. And I just sort of thought, it looked like big-time modern college football at Indiana. The stadium full, the pregame show, the atmosphere, the excitement, and then obviously the result on the field itself. I just thought it was proof of concept of something at least I'd never seen in roughly 20 years around this program, which is basically here's how football can work at Indiana, that the fan base will get involved, that you can win at a high level, that there is a path to Indiana being this kind of successful in football.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about this, and this is a conversation we've had on CrimsonCast a bunch as well. And it largely also it feeds over to like college basketball programs as well. Like, are there places you can win versus places you can't win? And I think for a lot of people, they view programs as being these unchangeable things where once you're a good program, you're a good program. And if you're not a good program, you can't become a good program. Or if you temporarily do, then you sink back into oblivion eventually. And I've always felt that ultimately there's nothing that says IU can't be successful at football. There's nothing inherently different about Indiana than the other schools in the Big Ten. The big differences have really been 2 things over the course of time. A, Indiana has not made the capital investments in football, whether that's facilities or coaches' contracts or just general support. It hasn't been a priority. And there's a long-standing set of cultural reasons why that's the case. Some of it has to do with basketball. Some of it has to do with other things. But that's only half the equation. And the other half, from my perspective, you have to hire the right person who's A, willing to take the job, B, good enough to actually bring a program up a few levels from where it started, and then be able to continually build on that momentum. It's rare to have like a microwaved top 15 program like Indiana's got right now, where everything just kind of got heated up overnight. But I think it's fascinating because this is essentially the next big piece in what has been about a 15-year track of Indiana slowly but surely providing the resources to take their football program seriously. And you go through all the facilities upgrades, you go through the gradual upgrades and coaching contracts, you go through all of the different things that have led to this moment. All of them were important, But then hiring a guy like Kurt Signetti and his ability to come in and immediately change culture, immediately get people thinking about winning and galvanize the fan base. Like, to me, all those pieces have been there, but you needed to hire a person who could pull the trigger to make all these other pieces that were put into place actually seem like they were working. And you don't see it very often in college football because it is such a top-heavy, historical program-driven kind of sport. It is really cool to me to watch it, at least in this first year, evolving the way that it's evolving at a place like Indiana, where a lot of people thought it wasn't possible.
I think there are almost two kind of companion conversations to have. And I'd like to start with the more sort of historical one. And when I say historical, I'm not talking about reaching back into the 60s or 70s. I'm talking about, kind of basically, let's say the Big Ten Network era, about the last 15 years, when Indiana was finally able to open the revenue streams to better sort of fund athletics in general. And I think what's important to note is the finances of an athletics department in some ways don't always work that dissimilarly to your own finances, which is like, if you're constantly struggling to pay your bills, then it's a fight to basically sort of be financially successful anywhere. But if you have like the ability to just like meet a responsible bottom line, suddenly like everything gets inflated a little bit more because you're not fundraising from a place of need. You're fundraising from a place of ambition. You have more success that leads to more game day revenue. Then that creates a more appealing, apparel product or media rights deal, whatever. And so I think that there's sort of been like this second order financial success that Indiana's had in the last 15 years that isn't just down to the Big Ten handing them a lot of money, but what that money has allowed Indiana to sort of build on top of that, if that makes any sense. And that, we could get into a whole separate conversation about that, but it does strike me that, a lot of people have sort of treated Kurt Signetti like he kind of, walked into the desert and dug a hole and found water. But it's Signetti himself who said at Big Ten Media Days, I get here, everyone tells me this job is hopeless. 3 years ago, you were one score away from a Big Ten championship game. And it occurs to me, in the broader sense, Indiana from 1994 to 2014 goes to one bowl game. 3 coaches in the last 10 years have gotten Indiana. Obviously, we don't know exactly what Indiana's postseason plans will be this year, but let's just, for the purposes of this conversation, say Indiana's going to a bowl game this season. That's 3 coaches in 10 years that have taken Indiana to 5 bowls. And I think 2 more 5-7 records on top of that. So 7 of the last 10 years, Indiana's won at least 5 games. And 5 of the last 10 years, Indiana's qualified for the postseason after I think maybe 2 5-7 seasons and 1 bowl game in the 20 years before that. So, when I can remember sitting in Fred Glass's office and talking to him about Kevin Wilson's tenure, and Fred saying, we're looking for Barry Alvarez, we're looking for Gary Barnett. I'm not looking, and it was a different time. And this is why I think these are 2 sort of side by side conversations, because they don't have to conflict. They can exist in the same sort of sphere because of the way the sport has evolved. But I think the first one is historically relevant, which is Indiana has tried very hard to be patient through this. And it hasn't turned over ADs a lot. It hasn't turned over university presidents a lot. It does not have what you see at some schools, particularly down where I'm from in the South, where university leaders, trustees, regents, presidents get too involved with athletics and try to be too hands-on, and sometimes wind up working pretty much directly at odds with the people that they put in charge of athletics, and particularly football. Like, there has been, if we're talking about kind of the last 10 to 15 years, I don't think it would be unreasonable for someone like Fred Glass or Scott Dolson, because they very much have worked in tandem through this, and then Scott took over for Fred. I don't think they would be completely unreasonable in saying, hey, listen, this is great, but there are pieces of this that were laid into place for the last decade and a half when people were saying we were being too patient, or, there were arguments about should the money be spent this way or that way, that Indiana's kind of cashing in on. All of a sudden, again, in the last 10 years, Indiana has more often than not been a lot more competitive than it was in the 20 before that.
Yeah, I mean, And a lot of it is, to me, tied into like three things. The sport of college football fundamentally changed when all the television contracts really started coming into the picture from about 2000 to 2010. And the money really changed. And you can look at Indiana from a developmental perspective with athletics and say across the board, Indiana fell way behind most of its competitors. And there were a lot of reasons for that. There was some upheaval with, the presidents, multiple presidents across that span of the university. There was a lot of upheaval in the athletic department. The football team made a poor hire that resulted in not very much success, and then hired a galvanizing figure who then unfortunately acquired a terminal illness and passed away, which really stunted momentum. So that's, one of it is that, like, there were a lot of false starts during that time period. And I think the athletic department was behind a lot of the people that would consider its peers, or the programs that would consider its peers, because they were in the process of modernizing while IU was kind of stuck behind. And that applied to basketball too. A second thing I'll say is that I would make the argument, if you look at the historical span of IU football from a records perspective, the period you're talking about, that, especially that the like 1995 to 2005 period, is probably the worst 10-year period of the program's history. Like, there's an argument to be made for like 48 to 57 or somewhere in that range, but they're close. And for your football program to have as bad of a stretch during that period of time when fan attention becomes really important, that's a really hard thing to come back from. And so I think that also delayed Indiana doing some of these capital items that you're talking about to try to set things in better shape. But that led to the third part, which is, IU fans had been conditioned over that period to not care about football, to almost ignore football, to, in many cases, treat it like a joke or as the butt of jokes. It really wasn't something that people got excited about. And you can go back and look at like the attendance figures from the Jerry DiNardo era, where the reported attendance at some of those games, like the Minnesota game, I think in 2004 at Memorial Stadium, was like 21,000. And Zach, a reported attendance of that, it means you got about half of those people in the stands if you were lucky. So we went from a nadir, I would argue, with IU football to a slow build up. And certainly the Hepner era helped some, because finally, after 13 years, it's like, wow, you can have success at Indiana. It isn't a complete lost cause. But that was...
People also forget, just to like cut across, because people talk a lot about like what Terry Hepner sort of meant symbolically, and his legacy at Indiana is just, for terribly unfortunate reasons, kind of an amoebic thing. People do forget Hepner was at the center of the fundraising that paid for the North End Zone facility, because that comes along before the Big Ten the Big Ten Network is a fully formed idea. What the Big Ten Network does is it covers a lot of the gaps that are created by inevitable overages and things like that between that and Cook Hall. But Hepner, to his credit, is at the ground floor of, we got to change these facilities.
And there's at least an opening to do that in the eyes of the university. I mean, famously, Bill Mallory had to go and fundraise for Mellencamp Pavilion over the objections and lampooning of his own university president. Like, Thomas Ehrlich is out there saying, I don't understand why we need to spend all this money on a football facility. This is like the president of the university going out and saying that. That's probably not the best way to fundraise. But that kind of captured the attitude that was pervasive across a lot of IU. It's like, well, why are we spending all of this additional money on facilities and doing all these things? And it's why you had so many outdated facilities at IU, and you didn't really have figures that were locked into the idea that this is a money game as much as is anything else. And like you said, I mean, Hepner being there to help fundraise for the North End Zone was such a key point, because the Big Ten Network money coming in right afterwards helps to fund all of the other capital improvements. And it's been across the board. I mean, I think people lose sight of, since 2005, Zach, we've had the North End Zone facility expansion. We've had Cook Hall. We've had Wilkinson Hall. We've had Kaufman Field. We've had Andy Moore Field. We've had the South End Zone, the marching band facility that's on 17th Street. I mean, the field hockey facility, I think, was built during that time period, or at least the current one. I mean, there's been so many capital improvements, but football at Indiana was always viewed as an afterthought, whereas at most major athletic departments, including most of the ones in the Big Ten, it is the financial engine. It's what drives everything. And I think that what's allowed all of this to coalesce for IU over the last 15 years is the gradual realization, which was, in my opinion, definitely spurred on even more by this most recent round of Big Ten contract talks and the new deals with all these networks. It's like you simply just cannot afford to treat football as an afterthought. You can't afford to just say, we're a basketball school, because it simply doesn't pay the bills. And now with the NIL settlement where you're going to have to chip $22 million out of your budget to pay NIL for athletes, it's even more so. So you're right. I mean, Fred and Scott Dolson, they laid so much groundwork, and it's not something that happened overnight. It had to be gradually built because there was such a little bit of a foundation for IU athletics leading into that period.
It's funny because, and I think each of these sort of three coaches we're talking about, like Kevin Wilson, Tom Allen, obviously Kurt Cignetti, each should get some credit in his own way. Like I think Kevin Wilson, I've said this on this podcast and other places, like Kevin Wilson is kind of the one that comes in from Oklahoma and says, like, I'm telling you all the things that big time football needs that you're not doing well. Tom Allen is the one that I think, in terms of like, and I understand it doesn't last, but I mean, that 4-year period where they go 5-7, 5-7, 8-4, 6-2 is very much sort of like, well, you can do this over a period of years in Indiana. You doesn't have to be like lightning in a bottle, and it doesn't have to be something that's incredibly sort of like emotional. Obviously, it's a special season in 2007 because Indiana is trying to honor Terry Hepner, but that season does feel like it is just kind of riding that emotion so much. 2019 and 2020 is much more kind of, we're going to go recruit kids that fit and we're going to develop them. And there were obviously a lot of successes from a recruiting and developmental perspective under Tom Allen. And I actually think, in a lot of ways, we've almost kind of taken the COVID season in both football and men's and women's basketball and sort of set it to one side. I do think the one thing the COVID season does that resonates for Indiana is it gives modern Indiana fans a glimpse of like what it looks like, what it feels like to see Indiana compete at the top end of the Big Ten, because and no one could be there. And sure, some of the results may be different if there are fans in the stands. I would point out Indiana's biggest wins that season came at home. So I think it's actually probably in some ways more likely that Indiana wins those, the Penn State game, the Michigan game. I don't know that you can treat those results as like, oh, that never would have happened during the COVID season, because those results happen in Bloomington rather than on the road. But I think there is almost kind of this, suddenly it opens the door to an excitement and a desire, because you talk about there's kind of a generation of Indiana fans that are almost, tacitly, by the behavior of leaders in the university, by just results to some extent, by, again, a lack of financial wherewithal, whatever, sort of given the freedom to just not invest very much in football, to just like, you don't have to worry about this, football is just not a thing that IU needs to worry about. I think that 2020 season and everything that comes out of it, not just the results, but also like the extent to which Indiana football suddenly feels like a little bit of a cultural force, that year. And Tom Allen is on ESPN and there's the LEO and everything. I think it gives IU fans a little bit of like, oh, not only can Indiana do this, but this is, having a good football program is something that we should really lust after. And I think that it's not an apples to apples comparison, but I always tell people who ask that, as a longtime fan of European soccer, the 2010 World Cup is like the pivot point for me, because that World Cup is all over all of ESPN's streaming platforms. And the number of people I knew that came out of that World Cup suddenly more interested in like, oh, I'd like this to be a part of like my life, high level soccer. It's like night and day from before that World Cup to after that World Cup. And it does feel, at least anecdotally to me, but I would like to think on some list of experts on the IU fan base, I got to be somewhere on near the top. It's out of that 2020 season that IU fans suddenly have an intensified thirst for football success that pushes a department that has already been investing more heavily in the sport to say, okay, How can we get more serious? How can we expect more of ourselves? For example, I don't know if Indiana pays whatever the 2014 equivalent of $15.5 million is
Right.
to make a coaching change after last season. But I think 2020 changes the climate around the program, and that ultimately, I think in a way feeds into even what you're seeing now today.
Yeah, I mean, I think how I would summarize what you're talking about, and I agree with it all, is it's raised the floor. That was the thing about the 2010 World Cup for soccer in the U.S. I mean, there were other things that happened at that same time. The Premier League starts getting shown on NBC, and every game is available. And suddenly, all of these players that you maybe see once every 4 years.
Well, remember, that was 2 years later, and actually,
I wasn't saying
NBC's push for those rights was partly sprung out of that World Cup because NBC was trying to establish NBC Sports as a channel, and they suddenly saw this appetite for.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Is like the World Cup pushes that up, and then that raises the floor even further. And I think with IU football, the way that the Kevin Wilson era is evaluated is always going to be hard for people who are watching the games to get their head wrapped around, because what you said earlier about it's not just about the results. Because look, 2007, they went to a bowl, but they couldn't sustain that. Like, that team fell apart very quickly, as it was probably destined to do, because it was built around one coach, and then all the circumstances changed. But the foundation there was no foundation. It was just kind of built up out of that person's personality. What Wilson did, and Wilson was not perfect, but Wilson did manage to internally make a lot of changes that not only raised the floor in terms of the win-loss record, but also raised the floor in terms of how the program thought about itself, and ultimately how fans thought about the program. Allen raised the floor further. And, coming off those two bowl seasons, remember the slogan that IU used for that first year that Allen was here was breakthrough. And the idea was, well, we're on the precipice of something special here. So we're going to break through, and we're going to get beyond the 6-6 that we'd been the last 2 years. They end up going 5-7, 5-7, but then they get that 8-win season. It's like, hey, they finally broke through. Who knows what the trajectory looks like without COVID happening in 2020? I'll always wonder that, because that was going to be a really good team going into that next year. And they could have won 8 games again in a normal 12-game season. They would have been competitive in the Big Ten, given the teams that they were playing. I think it's funny listening to Cignetti talk about the down attitude and like the doom and gloom. I don't think it's doom and gloom in the building or among the fan base in December of 2023. If you haven't seen what looks like the same spiral into regression that IU had experienced 14 years earlier when Hepner died and they come off that 07 season. And I think that is a really important thing to understand about the psychology of IU fans, and specifically IU football fans. Like, they have been conditioned. The 80s and early 90s were the same way. That was a great stretch from 86 to 93. Then they get denied a bowl bid despite having a winning record in 94. And then they go 2-9 and 3-8, and they don't have a winning record for another decade after that, essentially. I mean, it's been this constant thing where it's like, we can go so far and then everything falls apart. And so what's impressive about what's going on right now, and where I think the athletic department deserves a tip of the cap, is that most of those eras fell apart because it was the coach only that was pushing things in a direction, but there wasn't a lot of infrastructure being built under it to make sure that you don't have that fall off. And where the IU's at right now, the fact that Cignetti's able to come in, bring a bunch of transfers in, combine them with the players that were still here, and have a bedrock of success where they didn't have to start from the bottom. They were kind of starting from the middle despite the records the last couple of years. That, to me, is the big difference in terms of this is a sustainable program now. You've actually raised the floor to the point where you can't let it fall off. And you also can't let it continue to atrophy. I just made this point in class earlier today. It's like you can't say, we'll wait out the buyout with Tom Allen, we'll let it drop to this number. Like, the train's leaving the station for a bunch of different things in college football. We have to keep pace with it. Otherwise, who knows what happens moving forward.
Yeah, and I do think, I think Scott Dolson in particular understands that. It's worth saying, I don't know how public this is. I know I've mentioned it before. Dolson, if he's not still now, he has been on like the Big Ten athletic directors have like subcommittees and working committees on different topics. Dolson has, for the last few years, served as the chair of the subcommittee on television rights. So, like, he's been at the obviously he's not the one in the room negotiating with like Fox or or ESPN, but like he has been at ground zero of that side of it. So I don't think, believe me, it's not lost on leadership within the athletics department how important that is. I think the sidecar conversation to this one is the modern climate in college athletics. And you and I, in a kind of from the other direction, I was on your podcast last week. By the way, CrimsonCast, I did not mention that at the top of the show. I should have. I'm sorry. I have podcast fatigue. Probably not as much as Galen, but still a decent amount today. Absolutely. As always, recommend listening to CrimsonCast. I know you have only been expanding the offerings over there week on week since the season started. There's some really, really good stuff over there. Go check it out wherever you listen to podcasts, perhaps where you're listening to this one right now. But just finish this one first and then go listen to all those. You asked me, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but you asked me like if basically I had any other business essentially at the end of that podcast. And I said that I was beginning to believe I was wrong about the lack of merit of a 12-team playoff, that I wasn't a fan of the 12-team playoff, that I thought college athletics was, the point of college football was it was different from the NFL and it was better because you needed that level of perfection. And so it gave the product like its own distinct identity from the professional game, from the NFL, the way that March Madness does with the NBA. But I said that where I think I might have been wrong is that the field has leveled so much now, and we not perfect parity. The biggest programs are still going to have more money. They're still going to have better facilities. They're still going to have more appeal, but there's so much more opportunity now for programs that would not have had any path toward a competitive, top end of the postseason, even to some extent, like New Year's Six bowl games. The idea that we might wind up in a position where all of Army, Iowa State, Indiana, and BYU are in the playoff is, I do think, better for the sport. And it is reflective in different ways of how the sport has changed. And you said, that I think you said something a little earlier about how Indiana's kind of microwaved this against all expectations. But the thing is, you can do that now. I mean, like I was amused at not amused. That's the wrong word. There was something that was written ahead of the Nebraska-Indiana game about how Matt Rule is building, sort of the steady way, and Kurt Signetti was trying to microwave success. It's not really microwaving anymore. Like the way the whole thing is set up, if you have a responsible NIL setup and a fairly well-funded and well-fundraised, sort of collective infrastructure, and then you have a coach and a staff that have a good handle on what they need on their roster, how to find it on film, and how to move quickly for the players they need to be competitive. Like, you don't need that long to turn a football program around anymore. We used to talk about how turning a basketball program around was like turning a speedboat around, and turning a football program around was like turning an ocean liner around. It's not quite the same, but it's a little bit more like, I don't know, what's like a small boat, like a super yacht. It's not an ocean liner, it's a super yacht now, is what you're turning when you're trying to turn college football program around. Like, there is a part of this that is also very much reflective of the modern context, which is you can flip a roster more quickly I think this is probably the extreme end of success in terms of all of the talented players that Indiana's been able to bring in. But I mean, even like Washington's going to go 6-6 or 7-5 this year, for all that it lost off of last year's roster. To be able to flip that and still stay competitive in the Big Ten is pretty good. In the era of a 12-team playoff, there's a lot more opportunity near the top end of the sport for well-run programs. And and I don't think this should go under the radar either, the bigger these conferences get, the more likely you are to get a season like this one, where I don't think Indiana's played the softest schedule imaginable, But I do think Indiana's played a schedule that fell out nicely for Indiana in terms of who they played, when they played them, and where they played them. When you have bigger conferences, you're going to be less likely to hit a gauntlet because there's just so many more teams. You're going to be less likely to hit a gauntlet like we used to see Indiana get sometimes, where it'd be like, you get top 10 Iowa and then top 10 Michigan, and then you have to go to Ohio State and then Penn State at home. And all those things kind of wrap up together to actually create more opportunities for parity for a program like Indiana or Illinois or Purdue, if it's all well run and well marshaled, to move up faster than, and to expect more of itself is probably the important way to put it, than what we would have said 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, excuse me. The thing that I would say is like a couple of things about this. A, the expanded playoff is helpful because, I mean, there's a real chance IU could be one of 3 teams that don't lose a game in the regular season. And only 2 of those teams are going to get into the Big Ten championship game. And under the old system, you're just screwed at that point. So to be able to have more berths into the final pairings is really helpful, because that is the kind of thing that can really dim the excitement around a program among fans. It's like, well, gosh, even at our best, we're not allowed into the party. And this is where I've always understood your argument about college football demands a level of perfection that other sports don't. But the flip side of that is that when you only allow certain teams into the party, it does, I think, create this feeling that it's such an exclusive club that, like, why even bother? And this kind of goes back to the question of why would IU invest in their football facilities when Ohio State's always going to be ahead of them? Michigan's always going to be ahead of them. All these other programs that have these, Penn State, now you add USC. But to, as you said, be able to address through year-over-year roster change and all the things that Indiana engaged in to try to replenish their roster quickly, but also B, to have the financial stakes a little more level, kind of puts you in a position where it is worth giving it a shot. It means you have more investment. You see this in college basketball. I mean, one of the reasons why people love March Madness is because you get a chance to see non-brand name programs go and win a game or even be in the tournament and get their moment in the sun. And I think it's interesting because in college football, it's always been set up against that. And yet I've always said, like, in the NFL, no one cares that much what your seed was in the playoffs. All that matters is you were in the playoffs, you had a chance to perform, and it feels more inclusive and it gets more people excited. And I think it leads to more investment. And at the college level, where that investment is coming on a more individualized basis institutionally, that makes a big difference because, if I'm not going to write a check if I feel like I've got no shot at it having a positive impact. But if I feel like it's got a shot, I'm going to continue to invest in it. So I think that adds to the equation quite a bit.
I think the last piece of this, and I think what sort of closed, I guess, the final gap in the argument in my mind last weekend was seeing people experience game day, and not necessarily just game day, but more the wider concept of like what it feels like when you are at the center of college football's universe, like the crowd, the students, the excitement, the atmosphere, the way it kind of, the way it took the whole town. I think, like, to some extent, and I know that there are ways in which sort of it's a basketball school, like, some of that sort of is outdated. I understand, or at least, if not outdated, then a little bit too sort of generalized. But, the difference between game day or game day like shows for basketball, when you can't tailgate, when the crowds aren't going to be as big, when, it's a few thousand students in Assembly Hall, not a few thousand students among 100,000 people tailgating outside of a football stadium. And then even just the atmosphere in the stadium itself, it's sort of like it on the one hand, somebody asked me, like, what did I think of the scene on the day? And I said, I thought it was a great advertisement for IU football, for Bloomington, for just like the experience of this place and all that kind of it can construct around a football environment. But I also thought it was meaningful because it sort of gave, I think, and time will tell whether or not this is true, but I suspect it gave a lot of IU fans a heaping helping of understanding of what it looks like when you have a big, serious football program and why that is worth asking for and investing in and supporting. Because I know one of the most maybe common debates that you see among IU fans, I know you and I have had it, others, is, how do you get fans in the stands? But fans in the stands change atmospheres and not just, it's a tougher place to play in the fourth quarter, but like what the whole feel around your program is. I think that like it's almost like the last 10 years or the 9 years before this one, in a weird way, built up in some ways to this season. And then the first six weeks of this season built up to the Fox Big Noon kickoff weekend. And then the Fox Big Noon kickoff weekend built up to ESPN Game Day to all sort of tell IU as one of the largest living alumni bases in the country. This is what it feels like when you're good at football. And This is why it's something worth investing in, whether that's with your time, your money, your passion, your expectation, whatever it might be. And that doesn't mean that Indiana is going to be good forever and but it does mean that you can, at minimum, have the sort of thing that, for example, Purdue had for 10 years with Joe Tiller, where it was like, no, we expect to be competing at this level. And if we're not, then that's not good enough. And it's a little different with Tiller because there wasn't that, I don't know as much about the history of Purdue football, but my impression is there was not that long sort of runway period of multiple coaches, kind of building and contributing and whatever else. But it is kind of this idea that like, this is it. This is the formula. This is both the process required to be good at football, but also the payoff on the other side of it. That if you're an IU football fan, you can say, I'm not letting go of this. I'm expecting this. This is what I want going forward out of my football program. And in all the ways that fans can invest in that, here's the formula that gets it done, basically.
Yeah, I mean, look, Purdue historically, they've had, players that have competed for Heisman trophies, and they've gone to Rose Bowl. Bob Greasy was a quarterback there. Mark Herman was a quarterback there. You had guys that had played in the league. It was a program that, they'd had a rough 15 years or so prior to Tiller taking over, but most of those fans had seen or had heard from recent generations what it was like to have a successful football program at the kind of second tier level in the Big Ten. Indiana really hadn't had that except for the Mallory era. And, I think I always think back to the fake College Game Day that came here in 2017. And it was nice. It was like, hey, and ESPN's paying attention to us. But it wasn't really the same. And even Reese Davis said that in his social media video promoting last weekend, that this is really the first time Game Day's been here because it is such a different production when it's the Saturday show. When Fox had Big Noon kickoff here, what was it, 2 years ago, when Michigan was in town, that entire thing,
right.
Yeah, that entire thing was set up around Michigan and how good Michigan was. And there weren't very big crowds. It wasn't that big of a deal. Contrast that to what happened a couple of weeks ago with Fox Big Noon Kickoff, where they left saying that was as wild of an experience and as wild of an environment as we've had on that show. And then ESPN comes in with College Game Day. And, I haven't heard like specific things on that, but the kind of non-specific things has been, wow, IU did a really good job. And IU fans and students responded in a way that was really passionate and really jacked up. And that really resonated. And so all of these things, I feel like to some degree, IU went from being a novelty act with some of those items where it's like, oh, IU's a cute story. IU is chaos team, to now like, well, 2020, as you said, set the table where at least IU was in the national conversation for the large part of a couple of months. This kind of comes out of nowhere in terms of no one expected this level of success. I guess I kind of did. So did you. We both picked the team to win 8 games, but this is a couple of layers beyond that. I don't know what the reaction's like if Indiana hadn't had some of these kind of novelty breakthroughs into the larger zeitgeist over the course of this last decade. So I do think it's a gradual pattern. But I think now the taste is in people's mouths. There's no way that you went to the Nebraska game or the Washington game and sat in that stadium and felt 53,000 people like enveloping you, and the visuals. I mean, there's that one visual that the picture is floating around, looks like it's out of a video game, with the crowd kind of behind ponds and everybody's waving towels and all the videos from the interception. I mean, it looks like an incredibly exciting place. And if you were in the stadium, it's like that is going to resonate with you. Now, we'll see how sustainable these crowds are, next year or the year after that. But I think for a lot of people, the idea of Memorial Stadium being full and energized and completely focused on the game was something they needed to experience. And now that they've done so, it's a feeling you want to see repeated, and you're more likely to do your part in trying to make that happen.
Because listen, to your point about the scene inside the stadium and those sorts of things, like 53,000 is obviously on the low end of what a Big Ten stadium seats. But Davis Wade Stadium at Mississippi State only seats 61,000. Trust me, when Mississippi State is good, people don't like playing there. I know they got the cowbells and all that stuff, but Vaught Hemingway only seats like 63 or 64. There are plenty of places where you can get a genuine home field advantage, no matter how many, whether you have 50 or you have 80. If it's full, if it's loud, it's going to be problematic. And it just feels like, it feels like in a weird way, the last 10 months and the last 10 years have almost been happening side by side in sort of like for different purposes, I guess. I don't know if the best way to describe this, but they have kind of met at this inflection point, which to me was last weekend, of it all kind of clicking into place, and suddenly everyone can kind of see the forest and the trees at the same time and understand, like, this is what a good football program looks like. This is what it takes, but this is the payoff. And we will obviously see where the rest of the season goes. We will see where the Curt Cignetti era goes, but it was, for me, the first time in close to 20 years around this program that I would say I have seen proof of concept of how IU can be good at this level in football. Maybe not like the playoff undefeated, but very competitive in the Big Ten, nationally relevant, in that national conversation that you talked about. So,
and one last thing real quick.
Last word for you.
We've also seen proof of concept that IU fans care about football and want to watch football and want a good football program. That was always the line, that no one's going to care about football even if it's good. And I think what we've seen over the last few weeks is that is not the case. And to me, that is as big of a story as the financial investments and the good hire that they made with Curt Cignetti to get it to this level.
We'll leave it there. He is Galen Clavio. I'm Zach Osterman. Galen, thank you as always for joining us again. CrimsonCast, I think you all probably know where it is, but wherever you can, if you're listening to this, I'm guessing you know CrimsonCast too, but if you don't, wherever you get your podcasts, give it a listen. Galen and the whole crew over there, Scott, and I guess you're bringing Taylor Lehman in, and there's there's a whole host of a whole cast of characters bringing you more and more content over there every week. So do listen to that. Thank you for listening to Mind Your Banners. We will be back on Saturday for our post-game podcast from somewhere quiet inside Spartan Stadium in East Lansing, Michigan. Until then, I'm Zach Osterman for the Indianapolis Star. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.